The first thing anyway is to thank Liz and her colleagues in Warwick and her colleagues from Bergen for putting on this conference. I think even if I wasn't speaking, it's something which would immediately appeal to me as important and lovely to be at, especially because of its sort of interdisciplinary nature. Right, so on with the show, as they say. So this is the, just for people who might be interested for a split second, this is where I spend a lot of my time now in Bath. It's the Research Institute for Care of Older People. It's in the grounds of the hospital there, where I also do some liaison work. And for those from abroad, I thought they might want to see some pictures of elsewhere. So Bath is where we're based, and there's the Royal Crescent, and then Bristol is where my research post is located, and there's the famous Clifton Suspension Bridge. It's not a very good picture of it. It was taken from my car when I was stopped at some lights. And but when I was a medical student in Bristol, and I used to cycle across that bridge every morning, which sometimes was unnerving because it kind of wobbles a bit in the high weather. There is a sinister side to that bridge, which is that many people go there to commit suicide. And there's a very kind of frequent turnover of people jumping off the bridge, which is upsetting. Right, so a large part of what I do today is going to be talking about this project. And so I just want to highlight the people who helped with that. So you'll see that it was funded by the Wellcome Trust. Simon Woods is the reader of medical ethics in Newcastle. Mabel was the main researcher. Catherine Hearn is the CEO of this Helix Arts, which is an arts organisation which brings together artists and marginalised groups, really. And then Dominic is a curator who works for Helix Art. Nicola Bell is the manager of the care home in which we worked. And then Jordan Baseman is a world-famous artist based at the Royal College of Art, who was the artist in this project. So what I'm going to do is the following. I'm going to talk a little bit about, well, I'm going to talk quite a lot actually about these concepts of authenticity and citizenship. I realise there will be people in the audience who will know more about this than I do, so I'm giving you a very kind of broad brush approach just to highlight a couple of themes. And then the rest of this bit is all looking at the data that we got from the actual project that we did. And then at the end, we're going to play a short film, which was the film that Jordan Baseman made as a result of his work. So I am going to try and dash through these things a little bit, but you know, I'm happy to take questions and so forth and elaborate later on if necessary, because I do want to kind of play that film. So I won't linger too much over these first few slides, but so the project itself the aim was to look at the notions of authenticity and citizenship. We wanted to know to what extent and how people living with dementia in care homes express their authentic voice and demonstrate their citizenship. We wanted to know about the factors that contributed to that, and we wanted to say something about, or learn something about, the way art might contribute to that. I should say that this was just a pilot project, very kind of small scale. We only went to one care home, etc. But the point was to set us up for a further study. So again, I'll be fairly brief about this. So it was about the kind of methodology of the study. So there was a review of the literature. We then had Jordan Baseman, the visual artist, who came and he spoke with the residents in the care home, and he took films and he did recordings. Of course, we had consent, we had ethics approval. There was then a researcher who was watching all of this. So the researcher, Mabel, was watching Jordan's interactions with the residents in the care home. The researcher was just in the care home, watching what was going on in the care home. And the researcher also then undertook, so the artist was there for 19 days, but Mabel then also undertook some interviews with residents, relatives and care home staff, and these were then transcribed in the normal sort of ways, and using the constant comparative method of qualitative analysis, we came up with some sorts of themes and so on. So I can talk about that further if anybody wishes me to. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about just these two notions of authenticity and citizenship. And for each notion there are sort of two contrasting things. So the contrasting thing in authenticity is to do with the notion of the inner self and the notion of the outer self. What we're going to want to say in a kind of Wittgensteinian way is that actually you need both of those things, and we really want to kind of break down the barriers between the inner and the outer. But anyway, the literature about authenticity does stress, because authenticity is to do with being true to yourself, and so it comes from the Greek meaning to be sort of genuine, and everybody always quotes Hamlet, "This above all, to thine own self be true." So you've got to be true to yourself, so then that has implications if the self is inner. So what I am is kind of in here rather than anywhere else. So I have to be true to what it is that's kind of in here. And now I'm going to quote Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Oh, I'm not going to quote him actually. This is somebody else talking about Rousseau. And sorry, I'll get rid of that so that you're not too distracted by it while I'm speaking. So this is somebody pointing out that although Rousseau didn't use the word authenticity, most of what he was saying is taken to be about it, or a lot of what he was saying was taken to be about it. And the words I've highlighted in red, so although I'm just talking, as it were, sort of generally about authenticity and citizenship in this part of the talk, I want you to kind of have in your heads how this might be applied to older people and to people with dementia, living with dementia in a care home. So if I now read out this quote, the author says, "It seems obvious that all of the core assumptions built into the concept of authenticity are fully worked out in his writings. There is the distrust of society and its demands, and the idea of an inner true self, where this notion captures both the spontaneous child within and the noble savage that existed or is imagined to have existed in some happy age in the distant past. There is the nostalgia for an earlier state and the intimation that by turning inward and hearing the inner voice of the true self, one might make contact with the great groundswell of nature from which we have sprung. There is the idea that our access to the source of our being is achieved not by cognitive reflection, but by feeling, and there is a conception of freedom as liberation from socially imposed constraints." So I won't go through all of those things, but you can see immediately that phrase, "not by cognitive reflection, but by feeling," is very relevant to dementia. And you'll see from some of the quotes from the data that we collected that this idea of liberation from socially imposed constraints also emerges from the older people living in this care home. But I also like the notion of the noble savage. And it may be that I just need some psychoanalysis, because immediately that makes me think about people taking their clothes off. But of course, if someone takes their clothes off, perhaps I'm just always thinking about people taking their clothes off, but if someone takes their clothes off in a care home, of course everybody rushes up, it's a terrible thing, they've got to be covered up, it's kind of scandalous and so forth. But you can kind of step back and think, well, why? I mean, we're all born naked, aren't we? All these people in care homes have probably seen naked people before. They've probably lived with them, slept with them, and had sex with them, and so forth. So you can just raise a question about why it's such a big deal. There's often a sense of pathos attached to authenticity, and you see this in some of these existentialist writers. So to be authentic means to invent one's own way and pattern of life. Sartre saying, "Man is nothing else but that which he makes of himself. He is the sum of his actions." And then Gollum saying, "Our deaths and especially our ways of dying are touchstones for our authenticity." So the notion of death is very much there in this concept of authenticity. So continuing with this theme about the inner self, Rousseau and the existentialists, for them authenticity becomes associated with an attitude of openness and receptiveness towards inner motives in the assessment of the moral worth of action, and so that identity becomes a kind of source of normativity. So what the point that this is making is that if authenticity is, so if the thing is to be authentic, and being authentic is to be to do with yourself, then people have also suggested that that our norms come from ourselves, as it were. So and we'll see this in another quote from this quote actually, that so then it's said that the neoconservatives in the late 70s and 80s, for them, there's a mass culture bent on seeking self-realization and turning millions of ordinary lives into as many works of art. Now, there's something rather nice about the thought of every life being a work of art. That's rather a good thing, seems to me. But on the other hand, there's something sort of rather worrying about the thought that if we're all going to be authentic, we can kind of do what we like. We can kind of make it up. It's all just comes from us, and whatever I want to do, whatever seems authentic to me, I should just kind of do it, as it were, willy-nilly. So that's to do with the inner self. But then there's a sort of move to think a bit more about the outer and not to think of the self as just being what's going on in here. And we start to see this in Heidegger. So for a start, when Heidegger thinks about what it is to be a human being or a human existent, he then immediately starts to think about being in the world. So it's not that it's just kind of me, it's me in the world. So immediately there's some sort of reference to the outer, and he talks about authentic existence, and one of the ways in which he talks about that is to say that you're being authentic when you're not lost in the they. So we can all just kind of sink into the kind of mass of humanity. We can be the person on the tube in the London Underground who sees somebody struggling to get on, a young woman struggling to get onto the tube with her baby and her shopping and stuff, and we can just kind of sit there. Or we can stand up and go and help and be authentic in some way. We can step out from the crowd in some way. And then, so I've already mentioned death, and then of course for Heidegger, being towards death is a very important notion, that actually here we are existing, but we exist in the knowledge that we're going to die, and that should make us behave in a way that might, one way of characterizing it would be to say we should behave in a way that should be authentic. And then I like these notions which come from Heidegger, so these sort of three levels of care, concern and solicitude. So, and again, probably not doing justice to these notions, but the notion of care in Heidegger is just that I should care about all this stuff around me. It's because it's in the world and I'm here with the tables and cars and taxis and so forth. And so I sort of care about those things. But then, of course, when there's a human existent, then I have something more than that. So when I pass somebody in the street, it's not just like passing a post box, it's a human being, and I have something more, which is sort of concern. But then the real authentic being with people is this notion of solicitude. And in discussing that in one of those books that I wrote, I've talked about the deep engagement of authentic human encounters as being something sort of quite basic, which we should be after in practice, but also just in ordinary life. So then there is the notion of the outer self, of authenticity being a kind of social virtue. So it's so here are some statements about that, looking at Bernard Williams talking about truth and truthfulness, and saying what we call our authentic self, the self we access and express when we are being authentic, is at its deepest level something shaped and defined by society. So it's not just all in here, it's also something from society. We need to see that we draw from and are answerable to the shared historical commitments and ideals that make up our communal life world. And finally, the authoritative force of our decisions and commitments comes not from us as such, but from the authority of the cultural traditions and social practices that form the shared background of intelligibility for our beliefs, commitments, feelings, and decisions. My favourite quote about authenticity and this notion of the outer comes from the fantastic philosopher Charles Taylor, who said this: "Otherwise put, I can define my identity, so myself, only against the background of things that matter. But to bracket out history, nature, society, the demands of solidarity, everything but what I find in myself, would be to eliminate all candidates for what matters. Only if I exist in a world in which history, or the demands of nature, or the needs of my fellow human beings, or the duties of citizenship, or the call of God or something else of this order matters crucially, only if I exist in that sort of world can I define an identity for myself that is not trivial. Authenticity is not the enemy of demands from beyond the self, it presupposes such demands. And a bit later he says this, what we ought to be doing is fighting over the meaning of authenticity. We ought to be trying to persuade people that self-fulfillment, so far from excluding unconditional relationships and moral demands beyond the self, actually requires these in some form. The struggle ought not to be over authenticity, for or against, but about it, defining its proper meaning. So I hope in some of the work that we've done in this care home, but also perhaps in some of the work we hope to go on to do, we can help in this endeavour that Charles Taylor has outlined by trying to understand what authenticity means for people. Now, another fantastic writer about authenticity is Alessandro Ferrara from Italy. And so it's difficult to kind of pin down authenticity. And a lot of people find it frustrating that when you really try to pin it down, it starts to kind of slip away from you a bit. And it starts to seem as though it could just be almost anything you think of. So Ferrara has with a careful analysis of the literature around authenticity, has come up with a kind of some notions from psychodynamic psychotherapy, or at least from kind of psychoanalysis, which he thinks help to characterize. They don't really define authenticity, but they at least characterize it. And I think these are again useful in connection with our thoughts about people living with dementia. So I won't read out everything on the slide, but so the first way he does this is by thinking about the notion of coherence, so something about narrative coherence. So we live authentic lives if there's some sort of narrative coherence, perhaps. And the second thing he talks about is vitality, and he uses those words there like joyful, love, being spontaneous, and so forth. So being authentic is something to do with having this sort of vitality. It's also something to do with depth, and he defines that in terms of self-knowledge and the capacity to be alone. And finally, maturity, the capacity to maintain a certain congruence between our ideal self and the actual potentials of our real self. It's also to show an ironic acceptance of one's finitude. So again, this notion of death sort of creeping in. So to be authentic is, as Heidegger said, is to have this kind of awareness. It doesn't need to make us gloomy, it should make us joyful. We should be enjoying what we've got while we've got it, because we know that we're not going to live forever. So I've used the notion of authenticity in connection with aging, not much, but a little bit, in a recent book published by Geoffrey Scarr from Durham University has edited a book which is a handbook of the philosophy of aging. And so just before showing you the quote, in this small section of this small chapter, I'm kind of comparing the notion of authentic aging to the notion of successful aging. So those of you who know some of this literature will know there's been a tremendous amount written about successful aging, and it's often critiqued on the grounds that it's rather kind of biomedical. So you age successfully if your grip strength is good, if you can do certain sorts of cognitive tests, and if you and then because of the criticisms of this, it was slightly enlarged, and it also includes, being able to do some sorts of social things. So I've said establishing that our lives have been authentic was never going to be as simple as establishing that we have good grip strength or intact cognitive function, nor even as easy as saying that we served in the committee of the tennis club faithfully. For what counts as an authentic life for an individual cannot be established ahead of time. Authenticity is not at root an abstraction, it is a life lived well. So I'm now going to move on to talk a bit about citizenship. And again, making kind of two sort of broad distinctions between citizenship as being a kind of political thing to do with rights, and citizenship as being a social thing to do more with relationships. And in this book by Bellamy, which is a very short introduction to citizenship, he talks about citizenship encompassing these three areas of rights, participation, sort of membership. So there's a whole history, of course, to the talk about citizenship and its relationship to certain sorts of rights. And there's a very famous essay by this man, Thomas Humphrey Marshall, which has itself been criticised, and yet people still refer to it quite a lot because it's been very important in terms of developing thought. And he saw a sort of evolution from sort of civil rights to do with your freedom to own your property and so on, to political rights, the right to vote, etc., and then to sort of social rights, to be able to share in the full social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being. So here's a definition, so again this is from the same author, of political citizenship, which I just, as I read it, just want you to, again, to be kind of reflecting to what extent this is relevant to, say, people with dementia living in a care home. So he says, citizenship is a condition of civic equality. It consists of membership of a political community where all citizens can determine the terms of social cooperation on an equal basis. This status not only secures equal rights to the enjoyment of the collective goods provided by the political association, but also involves equal duties to promote and sustain them, including the good of democratic citizenship itself. So I think, I'm not going to expand on this, but I think that can be applied to people living with dementia in a care home, for instance. But people working in the field have been more inclined to move to a model of social citizenship. So here we have Bartlett and O'Connor in a very good book called Broadening the Dementia Debate Towards Social Citizenship, in which they define it this way: a relationship, practice or status in which a person with dementia is entitled to experience freedom from discrimination and to have opportunities to grow and participate in life to the fullest extent possible. It involves justice, recognition of social positions and the upholding of personhood, rights and a fluid degree of responsibility for shaping events at a personal and societal level. So I think you'll see some of those things emerging in the little bit of data which I'm now going to present. So it was a pilot project, so we haven't got tons of data, but there are some, nevertheless, in this short project, some rather interesting things were said. So we certainly saw a lack of authenticity and citizenship. So for instance, knitting was not allowed in the absence of care staff because of health and safety reasons. So there was at least one lady who loved to knit, but she wasn't allowed to unless there was a member of staff there, because otherwise, who knows what she might have done with her knitting needles. It may have been mayhem, carnage or something. One resident, when asked what being a citizen meant, what being a citizen meant, said, "Well, nothing now." And then she was pushed and she replied, "What does it mean being a citizen? It's gone." So that's a very kind of negative sense of, I can do nothing. Of course, there was regimentation with meals. Meals absolutely kind of define the day. You went for your meal at this time, this time, this time. That was kind of fixed, and then what happened at meals was kind of fixed. And we find another resident saying, "What's the use? A person living with dementia has rights and obligations, but they'll not be able to do that. If they've got dementia, they'll not know if they are coming or going." But then, actually, so this is, bearing in mind, so this is the researcher observing the artist, taking sort of narrative accounts from people and recording them. But actually, so what we started to, and then the researcher interviewing those people after these episodes, we start to see authenticity being revealed. So this is a family member, a daughter, saying, "So I think one day when they were trying to say, 'Let's put you in your pajamas,' and she said, 'My son will be coming. He'll think I'm senile if I'm in my pajamas.' So she's been more forceful than I thought. Actually, she is just totally true to herself." So this is a fantastic account of authenticity. So to explain the background of that, the lady had just been put into the care home, and then at kind of 6 p.m. or something, they were coming along and saying, "Oh, we've got to get you into your pajamas now." And the first couple of days, she put up with it. And then she said, "No, I'm not being put in my pajamas at 6 o'clock. I want to stay dressed until 9 o'clock or something." Here's another thing, a resident saying, "No, I'm what I am, and that's who I am. You have a bit more nerve to just do something if you want to." So that reflects back on some of those things to do with authenticity that I was talking about before. And I suppose that this might be something general to do with aging, the thought that actually, who gives us stuff now? We can do what we like. Here's a staff member saying, when he was on about that he used to sing, and that singing is the first I've heard Bill sing, so that got me. So the staff were actually quite moved by this man. They didn't know that he used to sing, when he was younger, and then they talked about it, and then he started singing, and a number of them said actually it made them cry a bit. But it also helped them to just learn a bit more about their residents. So another member of staff saying, for example, from the conversation interview that the artist had with the resident, I learnt more about the resident from that listening to him, and he's never really opened up and talked about his feelings in that way to us before, so I learnt something new. And in fact, the staff reported to us that, so some of this particularly referred to the relatively few men in the care home who used to just kind of keep themselves to themselves. And after the interaction with the artist, they were kind of coming out more, going into the day room more, talking to people a bit more. Here's a resident saying, I'm a quiet man and I don't express myself. Never again, never again. If I've got something to say that's important, I'll talk away. So then let's move on to citizenship. So the researcher said, do you feel part of the community here? And the resident said, oh yes, you've got to, you've got to. And she said, you've got to? And the resident said, you've got to make, do and mend. Now that could sound a bit negative, as if you've just kind of resigned to it. But actually it wasn't said in that way, it was sort of said in a more positive way, that actually you do have to just join in the community. This is now your community, you've got to make, do and mend. I should be reading out all these things with a Geordie accent, by the way, but I'm just not up to it. So still thinking about the political, so bearing in mind that the people who said these things were people who either had a diagnosis of dementia, but they certainly had cognitive impairment. And this is a fantastic account of citizenship in this sort of political way. So here's the resident saying, well, it's to be able to take part in the conversation regarding the wear and tear of the country, like to be able to discuss it sensibly, that I don't like the way the government are doing this and doing that. I like to be able to say, that's wrong, that shouldn't be. If I could do that, I'd be very contented. I don't like to be shoved in a corner and told that you must do this and we must do that. I don't like that. I like to be able to say what I want without being rude and objectionable, but I like to say what I feel about things, and I do usually. So again, that sort of sense of being free to be sort of authentic to yourself, as well as saying something about citizenship. And a resident said, to vote, of course, it's a right. You should. I mean, it was fought for. Voting was fought for, and you should do it. Now, there were several residents who made this point quite firmly about voting. You must vote. It's a kind of moral obligation. So they had quite a strong feeling about that. Now, that might be a cohort effect. It might be that other generations wouldn't be so kind of aware of how we've fought for our right to vote. I think it also somehow reflected the kind of socio-economic background of the people in this care home, which was in North Tyneside. And a lot of these were very good, strong Labour supporters who thought, you know, it's very important to vote. And then, fantastically, remember the artist was an American, I didn't tell you that, but Jordan Baseman is an American from Philadelphia. And he said, what do you think of President Trump? And the resident said, he's a funny man. He's rather odd, though. And then he said, I think he could be a bit dangerous. So no cognitive impairment there. But then moving away from the kind of political notion of citizenship to think about the more kind of social thing. So a resident said, I just like to help people. That's my way of being a citizen. And I love to walk up that path, which meant the corridor, though, and go into the coffee room and have a bit of a chat. And another resident said, oh yeah, I've got no power really except to complain about something. But nevertheless, that complaining, that person went on to sort of make, I mean, the point that they were making was that they could kind of do something within the care home to try to make things better. And then a member of staff said, I think sometimes we just forget and need to be stripped back down to basics, and you don't need anything apart from 2 people and 2 chairs. So I thought that was a rather a lovely quote. Well, amazingly, I'm kind of sticking to time, which does slightly surprise me. So we will be able to watch the film, I hope. So just a quick word about so Jordan did his interviews with people, recorded them by film and by sound, and he then went off and produced a work of art which is called La 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 La. I had to pause there because I'm tempted to just say la 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 la, but it's not. It's la 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 because it's part of a song. It's part of Amazing Grace, which I would sing to you, but I'm on camera. and my fans might go wild if they start hearing me singing. But just to put this into a bit of a context, so in a way, the film is a kind of separate thing. So one thing you might be thinking as you watch the film is, what has this got to do with authenticity and citizenship? And I think you'll hear ways in which maybe there is some sort of connection. But on the other hand, this is also just a work of art in itself, inspired by being in a care home with older people living with dementia. And it has to be kind of taken in that light. When it was initially shown to the research team and the team from the care home, actually people were a little bit aghast because of certain features to do with the film. Now, some of it has been slightly edited, so it's not quite as shocking as it seemed to be on that first viewing. But because of that, we were very keen to go back to the residents who feature in the film and really make sure they were happy about us showing it to people like you. And in fact, so this is interesting in itself because so here were all the staff thinking they'll hate it. It's going to upset them terribly, just etc. When we showed it to the people on the film, some of them just didn't like this sort of contemporary art. But actually, the main visual thing that you'll see, that person thought it was wonderful. She absolutely loved it. And when we said, are you happy about this? And she said, well, it's me. And she was very excited about the thought of her family being able to see it. We still encountered some ambivalence from the staff, and we had to sort of really kind of negotiate that with the care home and with the care home group. But they've been very good about that in the end, and we've had several discussions with them, and now they're perfectly happy about it. So I'm partly making the point that we've had consent twice to show this film, once at the start of the project, and then once we've shown them the film and then got their consent to use the film. Before I show it, I'll just finish talking, because perhaps I'll just end with the film, and I won't say anything about it afterwards, and you can just mull over it and see what you think. So the conclusions are that with the support of the care home, residents with dementia can and do continue to live authentic lives as citizens. That older people with dementia living in care homes are citizens in their own right needs to be acknowledged by wider society. And art that actively engages residents and the public in an authentic way can make this happen. So what we're doing next is, of course, we're applying for more money. In fact, the application to the Wellcome Trust went in on Tuesday, and we're hoping to extend this throughout the course of dementia and to look at more different types of artwork and involve more co-creation and intergenerational work and so forth. And so perhaps before showing the film, just this final thought that I started with, that quote, the famous quote, "This above all, to thine own self be true." But it goes on to say, "And it doth follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man." So the point about this was that it was never the case, in Shakespeare anyway, that it was all about yourself, because it was all about yourself in order then to be true to other people and not to be false to them. So thank you very much, and I'm now going to have some fantastic assistants to show the film. Is that all right, Elizabeth?